Hello Internet. So I'm really happy that my first video generated so much intelligent and interesting discussion. I'm mostly talking about the cognitive identity map, which is this abstract psychological structure, and it's very loosely connected with anything we usually talk about under the label of identity politics. It's also pretty difficult to wrap your mind around. So I'm glad to see that people connect with the project, and I'm glad that people can appreciate the connections with the broader political discourse. One of the criticisms that has come up in the thread a few times is that identity politics is hostile to individuals. Individual freedoms, agency, beliefs, rights like free speech. I didn't say much about individuals in the first video, but its relationship to identity is extremely important, and it deserves more careful discussion, so I hope you'll indulge another short lecture. Identities and individuals, some more lessons in identity politics. So I want to start with a comment in the thread from Patrizia, who gives an example of how identity politics undercuts the agency of individuals. Her example is transgender identity. So she says, many women, and this includes women who strongly identify as feminists and as leftists, reject the idea that transgender people who identify as females but who are genetically male are women. They're a faction who have gotten surprisingly little public attention. In fact, they're mostly shouted down within the liberal community. Their argument is that identity is not a game of pin the tail on the donkey, but a result of experience, agency of the individual. This conflicts strongly with the orthodox identity politics agenda. Patrizia goes on to say that she's not defending this view, but she's merely giving it as an example where identity politics is claimed to be threatening to individual agency. Okay, so here's my attempt to charitably reconstruct Patricia's argument. The argument works like this, and please let me know if I'm getting it seriously wrong. So first, some women think that trans women are not real women, quote, real women, but identity politics encourages us to treat trans women as real women. Therefore, identity politics is challenging or threatening some women's own conception of womanhood. Presumably this is bad because we ought to respect what women think about womanhood. So the implication is that there's something disrespectful to women about trans women who call themselves women because they're not real women. For what it's worth, this is not just women. There are some members of the gay community who have the same view. Milo was an example. So in less charitable terms, some women feel threatened by trans women because they see them as men who merely call themselves women, and some women don't think that counts as being a real woman. But this puts those women, some of whom are liberal and progressive feminists in many other respects, but this puts them at odds with the trans community and its allies because we want to respect a person's preferred gender identity and the pronouns they want to use. We want to treat them the way they want to be treated. And furthermore, we don't like all this nonsense about real women or who counts as a real woman. Who cares? So Patricia's argument, I think, gets it wrong in premise B. It's not part of the identity politics agenda to consider trans women real women, not because trans women aren't real women, but because the whole debate over who is and isn't a real woman is misguided. Look, identity politics is about taking identity seriously as a political issue. The women who are worried about whether trans women are real women are worried about identity politics just as much as everyone else in the debate. So this isn't about identity politics versus individual freedom. Attacking identity politics for threatening people's prejudiced beliefs is a way of protecting those prejudices from criticism. And there's a lot of unquestioned assumptions in Patricia's argument. What is it about being a woman that lets you say who is or isn't a woman? This is probably a good place to discuss androgen insensitivity syndrome, or AIS. AIS is a condition that affects about 1 in 100,000 people. AIS is characterized by an unresponsiveness to androgens, like testosterone. It comes in a couple of different varieties, but the upshot is that there can be people who are genetically male in the sense that they have XX chromosomes, but because they're androgen insensitive, they present entirely as female. Someone with AIS may present from birth as female and only develop female sex characteristics for their entire life, be entirely anatomically female, and not ever know that they're genetically XX chromosomes. These are women who identify as women, who are women. None of these women are trans women. These are women who were born women and have lived as women their entire lives. So AIS is one good reason to be skeptical of the appeal to being genetically male as a condition of who is or isn't female. These are all undoubtedly real women. They don't fit neatly into these prejudices about who does and doesn't count as a real woman. So this is the problem with the argument. The problem isn't that the identity politics agenda wants to treat trans women as real women. The problem is that there's women who have prejudiced beliefs about who counts as a real woman, and they use these prejudiced beliefs to mistreat their fellow human beings. Why is it that their gender identity prevents you from defending their rights? And more importantly, from my concern, what does any of this argument have to do with individuals? The concern seems to be over the boundaries of who is and isn't a woman, but it's not clear what that has to do with anyone's individuality. Okay, so here's my attempt to reconstruct the part of the argument that has to do with individuals. The claim goes something like this. Individuals have a right to their beliefs and actions, but sometimes political agents make demands of each other that they change their beliefs and actions. And when a group does this to an individual, it threatens their agency and freedom. Discriminating between who is and isn't a real woman threatens the rights of those trans women to be accepted in society. Defending those rights requires that women change their belief about what counts as a real woman. The worry that identity politics is threatening to individuals is the worry that if the identity politics people are right, then we'll need to change our beliefs. And people don't want to do that, so they consider identity politics a threat to their freedom, because they would rather not change their ways. So I'm trying to be charitable, but this argument is stupid. Politics should change our beliefs. In order for the civil rights movement to be successful, a lot of people will have to change their beliefs. And a lot of people will have to question their unquestioned assumptions. And a lot of people have to change themselves to not be prejudiced. I mean, it's hard. It's hard work. And being reminded of the obligation to do that work is threatening, because there's other things you'd probably rather do than be a good person. Being a good person's hard, and it takes deliberate and consistent and patient work. But look, if we took this kind of argument seriously, the logical conclusion is that all politics is hostile to individuals. That we can't engage in politics at all, not just identity politics, because every kind of political disagreement will require that people come to some compromise and change something about the way they do things in order to cooperate, in order to work together. This is how society works. Social cooperation makes demands and obligations on us, and it requires that we act a certain way in order to treat each other well. Maybe not always the way we'd want to act, and sometimes we have to change our beliefs for the sake of the facts, for the sake of fair and respectful treatment of others. The idea that this is a threat to freedom is ridiculous. Freedom is impossible without social cooperation. We have to be honest and fair with each other if the system's going to work at all. So here's what I think is really going on here. The appeal to freedom cuts both ways, and just as often as it can protect individual civil rights, it can also be used to oppress the rights of others. So consider, for instance, the language of states' rights. America has a long history of battle between state and federal governments, and so the language of states' rights appeals to the values of local control and self-governance. And this sounds good on paper, but in practice, the language of states' rights is often used to explicitly defend discriminatory practices, both against racial and ethnic minorities, but also against women and other protected classes. It's an appeal to states' rights, for instance, that has partly broken down the Voting Rights Act, which goes some way to explain the last election. To be clear, I'm not arguing that individual freedoms are bad, or that the society should always trump individual concerns. My claim is that the appeal to individual freedoms is often a rhetorical move that doesn't actually describe the terms of the debate. So on the one hand, we have the rights of trans women to not be killed or driven to suicide for using the wrong bathroom. And on the other hand, we have the feelings of white feminists who are worried that it's not fair that trans women use the word women to describe themselves. I guess in some loose sense this is about two cases of individual freedoms that seem to be in conflict. But to describe this as individual freedoms versus identity politics is a complete mischaracterization. Again, the point isn't that individual freedoms don't matter, but we need to ask ourselves which freedoms are at stake, right? Whose rights are being defended, and which rights? How does the right to use a public restroom compare to the rights of white women to decide who gets to call themselves a woman? Which is the more important right to fight for here? If we're interested in protecting individual rights, whose rights are more threatened in this situation? And where should our concerns be directed? For white feminists to say that it's not fair for trans women to call themselves women, given all the other circumstances affecting trans women? This is complete insensitivity to the identity of trans women. And my point here isn't to pick on the white feminists. My point is to show how, in this case, the appeal to individual freedoms is used to perpetuate oppression of individuals. And the language here is completely hypocritical. So when a trans woman wants to assert their rights, it's dismissed as identity politics and taken as a threat to individuals, as if trans women aren't individuals as well, with rights of their own that ought to be protected. But when white feminists want to assert their bigoted beliefs in order to deny the civil rights of others, this is somehow defended as individual freedom, as if they aren't playing identity politics. So this is a clear double standard, and this is the kind of double standard that's characteristic of systemic racism. The white feminists defend their own feelings without any concern of the feelings of others, and others are not allowed to use those same arguments in defense of their own rights. The individualist argument should cut both ways. Everyone's engaged in identity politics, but it's framed as individual freedom versus identity politics, and this is a misunderstanding of what's going on. So look, there is no defense of the white feminist rejection of trans women. They're just wrong. It's okay to say that they're just wrong. Patrizia offers the argument as an example, and she says she's not going to defend the argument, but in fact she does, several times. So in this top comment, Patrizia says, "Isn't the right to use a certain identity label in a certain context, isn't that the key issue in identity politics? These women feel devalued as individuals by one of the orthodoxies of identity politics. They feel insulted. They're very clear about that." Patrizia says in this bottom comment, "Well, I'm an outside observer to these debates, but yes, they do feel unfair. That's exactly the word I've heard used. It's one of those they didn't pay their dues arguments. In other words, they've had a lifetime of male privilege. In this sense, it's the same argument that Rachel Dolezal uses when she says she's black, except it doesn't work for Rachel, but it does work for trans women." Smiley face. So this is a defense of the argument that Patrizia is giving, and she's trying to distance herself a little bit from the argument, saying that she's an outside observer. But it's clear that she sympathizes, at least with these arguments, but she's not willing to identify as someone who defends them. And it's really because these positions are indefensible. Look, so compare the way that white feminists feel about trans women calling themselves women to the way that trans women are actually treated. White feminists want to say that their feelings in the matter ought to dictate how we treat trans women. It's just wrong. White feminists want to say that it's unfair that they're being required to change their beliefs about trans women. They feel insulted because the implication is that they have bad beliefs. And it's true, these are bigoted beliefs and they need to change. Justice tends to make bigots uncomfortable. Tough shit, deal with it. If you have a bigoted belief and someone calls you out on that bigoted belief, it's your responsibility to change your belief. It's not the responsibility of the critic to appease your feelings, especially when that critic is someone who's oppressed by the system that you're defending. Now, about the trans women are like Dolezal claim. So this is a place where Patrizia's prejudice comes closest to the surface. And again, the prejudice is that trans women are not real women. This is the unjustified and closely held belief that the prejudiced person is not willing to budge on. The first thing to say about this comment is that gender is different from race, and the experience of trans women is nothing at all like the experience of Rachel Dolezal. But dealing with this case carefully is a big bag of worms. But the only reason that Patrizia brings it up here is because there's this superficial structural similarity between a person who says they're one thing but appears to be another. There's a superficial similarity between the cases, but that superficial similarity fails to appreciate the difference between race and gender, and it fails to appreciate the experience of trans women. So while it looks like she's making a deep point about the nature of identity politics, in fact what's going on is that this is a superficial reference to a big can of worms that no one wants to open. This is a rhetorical dodge. It's misdirection. It's argumentative sleight of hand. Very few people are comfortable thinking clearly about the Dolezal case. That includes me. It's a weird case. Instead of actually dealing with the gender issue at stake here, she latches it onto this other can of worms that no one knows how to deal with. That doesn't excuse her failure to think clearly about gender, but it makes it harder to track where exactly her failure lies. This is how prejudice protects itself. My general position here is that thinking is hard. We're creatures of habit. We like our comfortable beliefs. We don't like to change our beliefs. And in fact, we'll go to extraordinary measures in order to avoid changing our beliefs. This is why people rationalize their beliefs. They make up excuses and reasons why it's okay to hold their belief. Okay, maybe I'm being too hard on Patrizia. She says she's not defending this view. And it's not really her point to defend the view. Her point is more generally about the nature of the identity politics discourse. So she says, what you're describing here are the very admirable agendas that are also associated with identity politics. But identity politics isn't all maple syrup flavored cotton candy, you know? There's some petty shit associated with it. So in this bottom comment she says, the fact that you, like most of my friends on the left, seem to interpret criticism as an attack makes communications problematic with those who do not share your unwavering commitment to chapter and verse on that one. Right, so the general point is that a lot of identity politics is wrapped up in a bunch of petty shit, and it makes discussion impossible because everyone's on the attack. No one's able to voice their opinion because they're too worried that they're going to be criticized for anything they say. Identity politics isn't all maple syrup. Who said this was supposed to be fun? Or sweet, or pleasant? The fight for justice and civil rights is a perpetual fight. It's a bloody and unending confrontation with power and authority. No one thinks that identity politics is supposed to be sweet and pleasant. Demanding justice isn't supposed to help you make friends. Justice requires recognizing and respecting our identities, and not backing down from the fight. People are turned off when you call them bigots. People don't like to think that they have bigoted beliefs, and people will use any excuse they can get to avoid changing their bigoted beliefs. Yes, people are petty, both the people fighting for justice and the people fighting against justice. But that has no bearing whatsoever on whether the justice is worth fighting for. When the white feminist is saying it doesn't feel fair to me as an excuse to criticize trans women, this is a petty excuse. This is the kind of excuse that must be resisted. If you're worried about pettiness and identity politics, this white feminist argument is as petty as it gets. They're not speaking for civil rights or individual freedoms. They're just defending their prejudices. This is the kind of thing that must be criticized and resisted and shouted down wherever it appears. The people who hold these beliefs need to know that they're not appropriate, they're not tolerable, and they will be confronted. If you find yourself being confronted for your beliefs, especially among the people fighting for the civil rights that you claim to support, then maybe you should consider that you are holding bad beliefs and that they ought to be changed. But my target here is not Patrizia. I have nothing against you. My target is also not the white feminists. My target is individualism, not individual freedom. Freedom is great, but individualism is one of the worst political memes in the barrel. I mean, there's a lot of bad political memes out there. There are explicitly racist and genocidal people who deliberately want to do harm to others. Of the beliefs that are commonly defended, this is the most corrosive and corrupting of them all. The individualist believes in things like self-determination, self-governance, responsibility, accountability. But the individualist has an atomic view of these things. The individualist thinks that your capacity to act is dependent on you, entirely isolated from your surroundings. One symptom of the corrosive nature of individualism is that we can't conceive of freedom or identity apart from ourselves as individuals. And this is just a metaphysical mistake. The ontology of individuals isn't given on any scale. Nature doesn't set apart individuals in nicely framed packages. Who and what counts as an individual in what context and at what scales? This is an ongoing question in all the sciences. Who are the relevant agents? What do they do? What are their properties? How do they behave? What can I expect from them? This is the basic stuff of science, figuring out who the individuals are. What are the smart ways of making the distinctions between one and another? The point is that who or what counts as an individual isn't settled beforehand, but it's something that we have to negotiate and decide as an active practice all the time. Political individualism believes that politics starts with an assumption about individual agency and freedom and responsibility. The problem isn't that individuals aren't responsible agents. The problem is that deciding who the individuals are is part of the work of politics. So the way that we think about individualism today is largely influenced by consumer capitalism, and these consumer identities are wrapped up with our prejudices about age and gender. Corporations spend a lot of money deciding how to divide up the consumer base into different demographics that they can target individually. If you want to know more about this, you might start with Adam Curtis's Century of the Self. I have a link in the slideshow. But politically, the value of individualism goes back much further than 20th century consumerism. It's entered the discourse mostly as a core value of libertarianism. Libertarianism is the view that individual freedom is the most important political value, and all the other rights and structures in society derive from this core principle. This is often framed in terms of the non-aggression principle. So let me be very clear, I'm not a libertarian. I'm an anti-libertarian. In particular, I'm an anti-individualist. I'm not against freedom. I'm not even against individual freedom, but I'm skeptical of the way that we delineate our individuals. And I think this is really important. The entire way that we talk about freedom in this country is framed entirely by these libertarian assumptions about who the individuals are. And I don't think you're ever going to get a useful theory of collective behavior as long as you believe that politics is fundamentally about the individuals. I'm not saying there are no individuals, but I'm saying that the project of figuring out who the individuals are is part of the political process. This is fundamentally because we are plural agents, and we identify with pluralities at every scale of our existence. The subpersonal or sub-individual level, I identify with my body, which I know is a bunch of cells and organs, organ systems. It's also my microbiome, where I carry a bunch of creatures around me, and everything I do depends on those creatures functioning well. So I understand the identity of my body as a biological organism in terms of all these complex plural systems. But not just biologically, but also culturally, so the way that I dress, the clothes that I wear, the tools that I have, right, the kind of phone that I use, all the talents and abilities, my background, my education, right, these are all parts of me. Right? I'm not just any of these things in particular, but I'm sort of all these combinations of things put together. But I don't just identify with these particular subunits of me, I also identify with communities that span lots of individuals, right? So my family, other groups that I'm involved with, my department, community of educators, all the interest groups that I have, my generation. These are large groups of people. Some I know better than others, some I don't know at all. All the standard identity politics identities, like gender, race, class, age, ability, nationality, and so on. Right? These are all group identities. These aren't individual identities. These are us identifying with a complex plural system. We identify not just with groups of people, but we identify with values, with expectations, with duties and obligations, habits. These identities are also not piecemeal, but they come as packages, as ideologies, as cultures. So we identify not just with these small groups that mean a lot to us, but we also identify with large groups that incorporate lots of different communities, some of which I might even be hostile to or not like at all. Right? So I identify as a U.S. citizen. There have been very few things that the United States have done that make me happy with that identification, but it's still an identity I have. That identity is very complex. It makes me do some things, it makes me not do other things. I identify with my city or state. Not everyone in that city is like me. Most of them are very, very different from me. I also identify with certain times and events. Right? We all lived through the Trump administration. That's going to be something that we will always remember. This is not something that identifies me uniquely as an individual. This is something that hooks me into a bunch of large communities with which I share all sorts of important things. Again, nowhere have I argued that freedom isn't important. I'm arguing against individualism, not freedom. We are not individuals. We are collectives. We are plural. We are legion. Okay, so this is about identity. So who am I? I'm not an individual. Who am I? So I want to say that I am all the pluralities that I identify with. I am a plurality of pluralities. Not just groups, but collections, networks. I am a network of networks. And I'm not just any network of networks, but I'm the intersection of all the pluralities that I am attached to, of all the networks that I connect up. And it's important to understand that the way that these networks intersect in my life gives me a unique perspective on how they all hook up for me. So I'm not just a perspective on those individual identities, but I'm the whole nest of perspectives that bring those identities together in the particular way that characterizes me as a person. So people talk now about intersectionality, and the point is that I'm not just male or Hispanic or employed. I'm an employed Hispanic male, and that makes me different from an unemployed Hispanic male. And those differences matter to our political outlook. Even though I share some identities with that person, I'm different in other identities. But saying it this way might feel like it's locking you in, that I'm not just a person, that I'm Hispanic and male and employed, and if you keep going through these Venn diagrams, you're locking in on a very, very small space. And right, the idea is that being in that little small space is confining to your identity, to your freedom. This isn't a problem with identity politics. This is a problem with the way that we understand it. You're not just that little space of overlap. You are all the pluralities that intersect on that space. So being Hispanic male gives me a perspective on what it means to be employed that maybe other kinds of employed people don't have. If you're a rich white male, then maybe being employed isn't that big of a deal to you. But as a Hispanic male, where unemployment is very high, it gives me a particular perspective on the field of employment. Right? So I'm not just that little overlap, but that little overlap gives me a perspective on all the groups that I attach to. This isn't a confining view of identity. This is an expansive view of identity. I am all of those pluralities, and my particular way of intersecting on those pluralities gives me a unique perspective on what they all mean. So if I'm this nest of perspectives, then where is the individual? Which individual? How do you carve up that nest of perspectives to say which individual in particular I am? There's no general way of doing this. Every particular individuation scheme is a negotiation where we have to make some decision about how to divide up all the objects, including myself from everyone else. These individuation schemes aren't given by nature. We have to figure them out for ourselves, and they're negotiated through the participation with all the other agents or potential agents in the field. Negotiating this identity map is, again, one of the hardest things that we ever do, but it's something that we're always doing. With every action, we decide what our identities are going to be and which identities we acknowledge of everyone else. And with each of these actions, we're constructing this identity map that we're using to keep track of who's who and what's what. So again, nowhere have I argued that individual freedom doesn't matter. I've just tried to put the appeals to individual freedom in the context of systemic oppression, so we have a better appreciation of the real force of the argument, and it isn't very strong. The argument on the other side is not that individuals should submit to the collective, but it's really about asking how do we respect the plurality of our identities with integrity. Patrizia is worried about identities that are pin the tail on the donkey. How do we build identities that matter? So I don't think freedom is bad, but if we're changing the focus from individuals to pluralities, then we need to change the focus from freedom to integrity. Integrity is about more than just being isolated. Integrity is about being integrated with the system around you in a deep way. So the obvious place to start here is with personal integrity, specifically with the personal integrity of someone who finds himself in a position where society is demanding that they change their beliefs. This is a straightforward problem for integrity. How do I stay true to myself while still changing my beliefs? This is not an easy question. Patrizia gives us a good example of how to reconcile pluralism with integrity. On the one hand, Patrizia is a good person, she's thoughtful, she cares about others and about our political circumstances, and about doing what's right. However, Patrizia also holds some prejudiced beliefs about trans identity. So how do we reconcile these problems? Because look, if you hold some prejudiced beliefs, then that makes you not so good of a person, but you are a good person, so what do we do about this tension between these different parts of your identity? Well, there's lots of ways we can go forward here. One way is we can be defensive. There's a sort of knee-jerk style of defensiveness, where you just say, look, my beliefs aren't prejudice. This is a reasonable claim, it's not prejudice at all. This is just straightforward resistance to thinking about the problems with one's belief. This resistance might not be defensive, but it might be hostile. Who are you to criticize my beliefs? Instead of thinking about the criticism, you attack the criticizer. There's another kind of defensiveness that's not knee-jerk and not really hostile, but appeals to the identity politics of the sort that we're talking about. And this is basically the kind of argument that Patrizia gives. So as a woman, I feel it's unfair. The move here is more sophisticated because it's not just about my emotional reaction, but it's about my identity as a person. And that identity gives you reason to respect that emotional reaction. This is still a defensive claim. It doesn't take seriously the challenge of the prejudice. I've marked these defensive claims in red. The blue claims are ways of reconciling these tensions where the prejudice is actually directly acknowledged. There's a sort of dim way of acknowledging one's prejudice. The argument goes like this. Well, look, if you criticize people, they'll just turn off and they won't listen to you. There's some recognition in this claim that there is some prejudice, that the way the prejudice is being dealt with is not conducive towards resolving it. Someone with this kind of dim self-awareness is still looking for excuses to not confront their prejudice directly. Someone who overcomes this resistance to their own recognition of their prejudice, we might call self-aware. We might call this the first stage of full self-awareness. This is the person who recognizes that they hold prejudiced beliefs and that they can't defend or excuse them. This isn't the end of the story. We might call someone who's self-actualized, the person who not only recognizes that they have these prejudiced beliefs, but also recognizes an obligation to change themselves and improve their actions and their habits, to understand better the perspective of others. In other words, someone who's self-actualized understands that in order to behave well, they have to change things about themselves. But even that's not the full story, because it's not just about you. It's really about the political environment. The full political agent is not just a self-actualized agent, but it's also the agent who can integrate themselves with the larger political environment. And this is the real key. If you're a white feminist worried about how you feel when trans women use the word women, you fail to recognize the role that you play as a political agent and the way these kinds of criticisms impact the larger political discourse. In other words, you failed to get over yourself. And being a full political agent sometimes requires putting the self aside in order to raise awareness and ensure justice for all people. Not just ensuring that you're being treated fairly, but ensuring that everyone's being treated fairly. And the important thing is that that's the goal of identity politics. The identity politics isn't just about me and myself. Identity politics is about who we are, both individually and collectively, and how that all fits together into an integrated whole. So how do we do identity politics without the individualism? Here's a few suggestions. First of all, don't pick a side. Or more importantly, be skeptical of what you're told the sides are, because there are no sides except the ones that we create. And so before you decide what side you're on, you need to decide what world you want to make. And that means you need to be picking not just your sides, but your values and your group affiliations. Pick your values carefully, and align yourself with the people who are building worlds that play nicely with your own. So just as an example, the pro-choice and pro-life debate, these sides don't actually characterize the nature of the debate in any meaningful way. Putting it in terms of pro-life or pro-choice is a way of perpetuating the stalemate in the debate, instead of actually advancing anyone's values on either side. Here's a second piece of advice. Judge people by the company they keep. Hold people accountable for their network. No person is an island. No person acts isolated from their culture. Building good people means building good communities. You need to be responsible for your community as much as it's responsible for you. The individual freedom people like to talk about personal responsibility. But responsibility means responsibility for your community, and your community being responsible for you. And if you're not talking about our collective responsibility in this way, then you're trying to shirk responsibility, not protecting individual freedom, but ensuring systemic oppression. This is why libertarianism is a scam. Libertarianism tells you who the individuals are, and then it tells you the structures that are required to protect those individuals. And it takes away our negotiating power to decide where the bounds of individuals lie. It claims to be protecting individual freedom, but in fact, it deprives us of the crucial capacity to decide our individuation schemes. Being able to decide how to carve out the individuals is a basic political right, and libertarianism starts after that right has already been settled. This is why understanding identity pluralism and resisting individualism is such a hard challenge. The last thing to say here, and it's probably the easiest thing, is that being a pluralist with integrity requires admitting that sometimes you might be wrong. Sometimes you might have to change your belief. Look, it's likely that you're wrong. You're a human being. Most people are wrong. That doesn't make you a bad person. That just makes you human. What does make you a bad person is stubbornly refusing to adjust your behavior to accommodate the people around you, making excuses to justify your prejudiced beliefs and for refusing to change them, understanding that you can change them, and that you have an obligation to change them, and that you can become a better person. Whew, that was a rough one. If you're still watching, I appreciate the attention, and I hope this is taken in the constructive spirit in which it's offered. Alright, I've said enough. Thanks, everyone.